For years, people asked the same question. Who is Barron Trump? A ghost in the political world, a mystery in plain sight. But what if the silence was the strategy? His name is known by millions. His face instantly recognizable. Yet when you think of Barron Trump, what do you really know? Unlike the children of past presidents, Barron never took center stage. While the world dissected every word, every action, every controversy surrounding his family, he remained silent, a name without a voice, a presence without a platform. And in that silence, a myth was created. There was a time when being the child of a president meant living under constant media scrutiny. Chelsea Clinton, forced into the limelight at a young age. The Bush twins, their every move analyzed. Sasha and Malia Obama, growing up under the watchful eyes of a nation. But Barron? He was different. From the moment his father stepped into the White House, Barron Trump was an enigma. He appeared in photos, standing tall, yet always just outside the focus. He walked the halls of power, but never spoke a word to the press. Unlike his older siblings, Ivanka, Donald Jr., and Eric, who embraced the media, Barron remained in the shadows. But was this by choice or by design? When his father took office, Barron was just 10 years old, a child, suddenly living in the most powerful house in the world. A house where privacy barely existed, a house where every movement, every expression could become a headline. Most children would have crumbled under the pressure, but Barron didn't. Instead, he did something no other presidential child had done before. He disappeared. Not physically, of course. He was there, standing beside his mother, Melania, as she shielded him from the chaos of Washington. He was there, occasionally glimpsed at public events, his face unreadable, his posture composed. But while others used their voices, he chose something different. Silence. And in that silence, the world began to wonder. Because when someone doesn't speak, people fill in the gaps. They speculate, they project, they build a story around the mystery. Some said he was just a normal kid trying to survive an abnormal life. Others whispered of something more, a sharp mind, absorbing everything, a strategist in the making, a young man growing up not just in the shadow of his father, but watching, learning, waiting. And as the years passed, the speculation grew louder. Would he follow in his father's footsteps? Would he reject the Trump legacy altogether? Would he ever step into the light? For over a decade, the world was left with questions. And then came the interview. For the first time, Barron Trump was no longer a spectator. For the first time, he had a voice. For the first time, the world would hear him speak. And what he said changed everything. For years, people asked the same question. Who is Barron Trump? A ghost in the political world, a mystery in plain sight. But what if the silence was the strategy? His name is known by millions. His face instantly recognizable. Yet when you think of Barron Trump, what do you really know? Unlike the children of past presidents, Barron never took center stage. While the world dissected every word, every action, every controversy surrounding his family, he remained silent, a name without a voice, a presence without a platform. And in that silence, a myth was created. There was a time when being the child of a president meant living under constant media scrutiny. Chelsea Clinton, forced into the limelight at a young age. The Bush twins, their every move analyzed. Sasha and Malia Obama, growing up under the watchful eyes of a nation. But Barron? He was different. From the moment his father stepped into the White House, Barron Trump was an enigma. He appeared in photos, standing tall, yet always just outside the focus. He walked the halls of power, but never spoke a word to the press. Unlike his older siblings, Ivanka, Donald Jr., and Eric, who embraced the media, Barron remained in the shadows. But was this by choice or by design? When his father took office, Barron was just 10 years old, a child, suddenly living in the most powerful house in the world. A house where privacy barely existed. A house where every movement, every expression could become a headline. Most children would have crumbled under the pressure, but Barron didn't. Instead, he did something no other presidential child had done before. He disappeared. Not physically, of course. He was there, standing beside his mother, Melania, as she shielded him from the chaos of Washington. He was there, occasionally glimpsed at public events, his face unreadable, his posture composed. But while others used their voices, he chose something different. Silence. And in that silence, the world began to wonder. Because when someone doesn't speak, people fill in the gaps. They speculate, they project, they build a story around the mystery. Some said he was just a normal kid trying to survive an abnormal life. Others whispered of something more. A sharp mind, absorbing everything. A strategist in the making. A young man growing up not just in the shadow of his father, but watching, learning, waiting. And as the years passed, the speculation grew louder. Would he follow in his father's footsteps? Would he reject the Trump legacy altogether? Would he ever step into the light? For over a decade, the world was left with questions. And then came the interview. For the first time, Barron Trump was no longer a spectator. For the first time, he had a voice. For the first time, the world would hear him speak. And what he said changed everything. For years, he avoided the cameras. But tonight, for the first time, he stepped forward. And the world was watching. A TV host known for tearing politicians apart. A young man stepping into the spotlight for the first time. This was more than an interview. It was a battlefield. The room was tense. Not the kind of tension that comes from discomfort, but the kind that precedes a storm. The cameras were in position. The lights cast a golden hue over the stage. The seats in the audience were filled, but no one spoke. They were waiting. At the center of it all sat Victoria Steele. Her name alone carried weight. She had built her career on exposing the cracks in powerful people, forcing seasoned politicians, billionaires, and celebrities to crumble under the force of relentless questioning. Her interviews weren't just conversations, they were confrontations. And tonight, her target was different. Across from her sat Barron Trump, the silent son, the enigma, the one who had spent his entire life avoiding moments exactly like this. But tonight, he had chosen to be here. Victoria adjusted in her chair, taking a measured breath. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment. This wasn't just another guest. This was the son of a former president. A young man who had been shielded from the media for years, yet whose last name carried an undeniable political weight. She wasn't here to make conversation. She was here to break him. The audience leaned forward as the opening theme faded. The pleasantries were over. The battle was about to begin. Victoria arched an eyebrow, her expression unreadable, yet brimming with confidence. Then she spoke. "Barron," she began, her voice smooth yet sharp. "This is an interview a lot of people have been waiting for." Silence. Barron didn't flinch. He didn't shift uncomfortably or break into nervous laughter like so many before him. Instead, he gave a slight nod, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that spoke volumes. He wasn't here to play her game. Victoria's lips curled into a subtle smirk. She had seen this kind of confidence before from world leaders, CEOs, even military generals. But they had all been seasoned, experienced. Barron Trump? He was barely 20 years old. She leaned forward slightly. "You're a name people recognize," she continued, "yet few actually know you. That changes tonight." The tension in the studio thickened. This was her opening move. She wasn't just asking a question, she was setting the stage for dominance. Because if Barron fumbled here, if he hesitated, he would spend the rest of the interview trying to recover. The room was silent. And then Barron spoke. His voice wasn't hesitant. It wasn't shaky. It was calm, controlled, steady. "Does it?" he asked. Just 2 words, but they shifted the entire energy in the room. Because in that moment, it was clear this wasn't going to be a typical interview. This wasn't a young man stumbling through rehearsed talking points, trying to survive an onslaught of aggressive questioning. This was a game of chess, and Barron Trump had just made the first move. She had questioned hundreds of powerful figures, but this time, she was losing control. The first question was a trap. But what happened next caught everyone off guard. Victoria Steele was used to controlling the conversation. It was what made her one of the most feared interviewers in the industry. She knew how to lead a guest into a corner, how to make them squirm, how to expose the cracks in their carefully built personas. And yet, as she sat across from Barron Trump, something was different. He wasn't squirming. He wasn't even blinking. He had just turned her own question back on her with nothing more than 2 words. "Does it?" For the first time that night, Victoria felt something she hadn't felt in years. A challenge. The audience, once silent, began to shift in their seats. They could sense it too. Something was happening here. Victoria smiled, adjusting her posture. This was fine. She wasn't rattled. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, anticipating every possible response. She already had her next move ready. "Let's talk about perception," she said smoothly, leaning forward. "You've grown up in the public eye, but you've also managed to remain elusive. Some say that's intentional. Others say it's because you've had nothing to say. Which is it?" It was a loaded question. If Barron admitted to staying out of the spotlight intentionally, he would be seen as calculated, perhaps even hiding something. If he admitted he simply had nothing to say, he would come across as uninformed, unimportant. Either answer could be a weakness. For a split second, the audience held their breath. Then Barron leaned back, just slightly. His movements were controlled, deliberate. "Silence isn't always absence, Victoria," he said. "Sometimes it's preparation." A murmur rippled through the studio. It wasn't just an answer, it was a statement. And it had caught Victoria off guard. She tilted her head, studying him. Most guests, when pushed, defended themselves. They over-explained, fumbled, tried to regain footing. But not him. He wasn't just answering the question, he was controlling the conversation. Victoria narrowed her eyes slightly. If subtlety wouldn't shake him, then she would shift to pressure. "You've been in the public eye your entire life," she pressed, "whether you wanted it or not. Do you ever feel like you're merely a product of perception, that people have already decided who you are, regardless of what you say?" It was another trap. If Barron agreed, then he was admitting he had no control over his own identity. If he denied it outright, then he risked sounding naive. The weight of the question settled into the space between them, and yet he didn't rush to answer. Instead, he let the silence stretch, commanding the space rather than filling it with nervous words. Then he exhaled softly, his voice steady. "Perception is an interesting thing," he finally said. "It tells you more about the people observing than the person being observed." The room shifted. Victoria's eyes flickered. He wasn't just responding, he was redirecting. This wasn't the reaction of someone caught off guard. This was the move of someone who had anticipated the attack. A few audience members exchanged glances. This wasn't what they had expected. Victoria realized it too. For the first time, she wasn't just conducting an interview. She was in a duel. She had questioned hundreds of powerful figures, but this time she was losing control. One question, one answer. A moment that sent shockwaves through the room. Victoria Steele was no stranger to difficult guests. She had interviewed presidents, world leaders, billionaires, people who had spent decades mastering the art of public manipulation. But as she sat across from Barron Trump, something became clear. This wasn't just another guest. This wasn't just another interview. This was a chess match, and he wasn't playing defense. She adjusted her posture, eyes narrowing slightly. If subtlety and pressure weren't enough to break his composure, she had one more weapon left. She leaned in, lowering her voice just slightly, making the moment feel more intimate, more dangerous. "You were born into wealth, power, influence," she said. "You didn't have to fight for a place at the table. You inherited it. Would you call that privilege, or do you reject that label?" The audience went still. This wasn't just a question. It was a trap. If Barron admitted to privilege, he risked alienating those who resented power. If he denied it, he would be branded as out of touch, a young man blind to the realities of the world, a lose-lose scenario. For the first time, Victoria felt a flicker of confidence. This was it. The moment where he would stumble, the moment where she could regain control. But then, Barron smiled. Not a full grin, not arrogance, just the faintest flicker of amusement. And then he answered. "Privilege is an interesting word," he mused. "If a doctor's child grows up with access to the best education, are they privileged? If a musician's son grows up surrounded by music, is that privilege? Or is privilege just another way of saying that some people start their journey differently?" Silence. Not the awkward kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that makes people question everything they thought they knew. Victoria's fingers twitched against the desk because she recognized what he was doing. He wasn't answering the question. He was reframing it, reshaping the very structure of the conversation. If she pushed harder, she would look aggressive. If she backed off, she would look weak. It was a move she had seen seasoned politicians use, but never like this. Never from someone this young. She adjusted, shifting tactics. "So, you acknowledge it then?" she pushed. Barron met her gaze, unshaken, unmoved. "I acknowledge that no one chooses where they start," he said smoothly. "Only where they go from there." A ripple passed through the audience. Some nodded in quiet approval. Others exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing something they hadn't expected. Barron Trump wasn't just surviving this interview, he was winning it, and Victoria knew it. If she didn't pivot now, she would become the one on the defensive. She had to move fast. "Fair enough," she said, shifting gears. "Let's talk about something that isn't defined by privilege." She exhaled slowly. Then she dropped the next bombshell. Public scrutiny. The audience tensed. They knew where this was going. "Unlike the rest of your family, you've managed to stay out of the media's direct line of fire for most of your life," she continued. "Until now. So tell me, Barron, why step into it now?" It was the question everyone had been waiting for, and how he answered it would change everything. At this moment, it wasn't just an interview anymore. It was something bigger. It was a statement. Then came the ultimate question. One designed to corner him, to force him into a response that could end his career before it even began. But instead, he did something no one saw coming. For the first time that night, Victoria Steele felt something unfamiliar. She was running out of moves. Every question had been met with composure. Every attempt to shake him had been sidestepped. Every trap had been turned into an opportunity, and the audience knew it. They had come expecting to see a young man put on trial. Instead, they were witnessing a masterclass in control. But Victoria had one last move left, a question so sharp, so divisive, that even the most seasoned political figures struggled to answer it. She shifted slightly in her chair, her voice dropping just enough to signal the weight of the moment. "Your last name carries history, Barron," she said. "Some of it admired, some of it, controversial." The air in the room tightened. The audience knew exactly where this was going. "Your father has been one of the most polarizing figures in modern history," she continued. "Some revere him. Others believe he was the most divisive leader of our time." She let the words settle. Then she delivered the final blow. "Tell me, Barron, have you ever, even for a moment, been ashamed of something he has said or done?" A sharp intake of breath. The audience, the crew, even the people watching from home, they all felt it. This was the question. The moment that could define the entire interview. A yes would be seen as a betrayal. A no would make him blindly loyal. And hesitation? That would be worse than either. Victoria sat perfectly still, watching, waiting, expecting finally to see a crack. But Barron Trump did not flinch. He did not shift in his chair. He did not break eye contact. Instead, he let the silence stretch, not out of hesitation, out of control. Then, he spoke. "Have you ever been ashamed of something President Biden has said or done?" The reaction was immediate. Gasps, scattered laughter, hushed whispers of admiration, because in a single sentence, he had flipped the script. Victoria blinked. For the first time all night, she had not prepared for this response. She quickly regained composure, her voice controlled. "This isn't about me, Barron," she countered. Barron's gaze didn't waver. "Isn't it?" he asked. "You're a journalist. Your job is to challenge assumptions, to make the public think. So tell me, why is it a fair question to ask if I'm ashamed of my father? But if I ask the same about President Biden, it suddenly isn't." The audience erupted, louder than before. Some clapped. Others exchanged stunned glances, because they knew. At that moment, the balance of power had shifted. Victoria inhaled deeply. She had spent her career pushing guests into uncomfortable corners, yet somehow, tonight, she was the one feeling the pressure. She had to regain control, now. "All right," she said, adjusting. "Let's bring this back to you." The audience settled. Barron remained poised. "You've spent this interview proving that you can handle pressure, that you can hold your own," Victoria said. "But let's cut through all of that." Her voice lowered. "At the end of the day, do you truly know who you are? Or are you just a product of media perception?" A dangerous question. One that could shake even the most prepared guests. And yet, Barron didn't hesitate. "If I were just a name," he said, his voice calm, "then why am I sitting here answering these questions myself?" The room erupted. For the final time that night, the energy in the studio was undeniable. Even Victoria, despite everything, felt the weight of what had just happened. She had set the stage for an interrogation. Instead, Barron Trump had turned it into a declaration. And for the first time, all night, she realized she wasn't the one in control anymore. He was. The interview was ending, but its impact, that would last far beyond the closing credits. Was he just his father's son? Or was he something more? This was the defining moment. The battle was nearly over, and yet Victoria Steele wasn't ready to concede defeat. Not yet. She had spent her career breaking down political figures, shattering their carefully built facades, exposing their vulnerabilities. But tonight, something had shifted. She wasn't dealing with someone who needed to hide behind rehearsed answers. She wasn't dealing with someone eager to please or desperate to win approval. She was dealing with someone who knew exactly who he was, and that made him more dangerous than she had anticipated. She exhaled slowly, watching him across the desk. The studio lights reflected off his suit. He sat perfectly still, his posture unwavering. And in that moment, she understood. He wasn't just surviving this interview. He was defining himself. And so, with one last move left to play, she placed her notes down on the desk, folding her hands neatly on top of them. No script, no prepared questions, just one final challenge. "Let's be honest, Barron," she said, her voice smooth, measured. "Your last name is one of the most polarizing in modern history. It carries weight, power, controversy, expectation. Whether you like it or not, it has shaped how people see you." She let the moment hang. Then, the final question. "My question is simple. Has it also shaped how you see yourself?" Silence, a different kind of silence this time. Not uncertainty, anticipation, because everyone knew this was it, the defining moment. Barron met her gaze. He did not shift in his chair. He did not blink under the weight of the question. Instead, he did what he had done all night. He took control. "Everyone is shaped by where they come from," he said. "But the difference between being shaped and being defined is a matter of choice." The words settled over the room, not flashy, not aggressive, just undeniable. Victoria let the answer linger. It was clean, polished, a near-perfect sidestep. But she wasn't done yet. Not quite. She leaned forward, pressing once more. "You speak of choice," she said, "but how much choice have you really had? You were born into wealth, power, influence. You didn't have to fight for a place at the table. You inherited it. Would you say that's privilege? Or do you reject that label?" It was the final trap. A question designed to force him into a corner he couldn't escape. If he admitted to privilege, he risked alienating those who resented power. If he denied it, he would be seen as out of touch with reality. But Barron did not react. He did not tense. Instead, he exhaled, just the faintest flicker of something in his eyes, something knowing. "Privilege is an interesting word," he mused. "If a doctor's child grows up with access to the best education, are they privileged? If a musician's son grows up surrounded by music, is that privilege? Or is privilege just another way of saying that some people start their journey differently?" The audience held their breath because they knew. At that moment, the balance of power had shifted for good. Victoria's fingers twitched against the desk because he wasn't answering the question. He was reshaping it. She adjusted her posture. For the first time all night, she was out of moves. She sat back, letting out a slow exhale. Then, finally, she smiled. Not in frustration, not in defeat, in recognition. She had spent the night testing him, waiting for the moment when his composure would crack, when the weight of expectation, pressure, and scrutiny would force him into a corner he couldn't escape. But that moment never came. Instead, Barron Trump had taken every question, every carefully laid trap, and turned it into an opportunity to define himself, not as his father's son, not as a political pawn, but as his own man. She nodded, glancing at the audience, then back at him. "Well, Barron," she said, "I think we can all agree on one thing tonight." She let the words settle. Then, for the first time, she acknowledged what had just happened. "You're not just another political figure's son." Barron gave a slow nod, a quiet but knowing acknowledgement. Then the interview was over. The interview ended. But the conversation, that was just beginning. The interview ended, but the conversation, that was just beginning. The cameras powered down. The studio lights dimmed. The crew moved quickly, wrapping up their equipment. The murmurs of the audience, once electrified with energy, now settled into quiet conversation. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because while the interview may have ended, its impact was just beginning. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips from the interview flooded Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Barron Trump just outmaneuvered the most aggressive TV host in the game. This wasn't an interview. This was a statement. Victoria Steele met her match, and she knew it. Hashtags trended within the hour. Comment sections exploded with debates. People weren't just talking about what had been said, they were talking about what it meant. Because for years, Barron Trump had been an enigma, a silent figure in the background of American politics. A name, but never a voice. Until now. And now, there was only one question left. Was this just an interview? Or was it the beginning of something more? Political analysts took to the airwaves. Some dismissed it as a well-prepared PR stunt. Others called it a strategic move, signaling his future in politics. But one thing was certain. Barron Trump had just changed his narrative forever. The way people saw him wasn't the same anymore. He was no longer just the quiet Trump, no longer just a footnote in his father's legacy. He had stepped forward, he had spoken, and people had listened. And that raised a new possibility, a question that, just a day before, would have been dismissed outright. Would Barron Trump ever follow in his father's footsteps? The thought alone was enough to ignite a storm of headlines. The political world held its breath, because whether you admired him or opposed him, whether you saw him as a new voice or just another name in a long political dynasty, one thing was undeniable. Barron Trump was no longer just a figure in the background, and that meant, for the first time ever, his future was his to decide. So was this just an interview, or was it the first move in a much bigger game? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain. Barron Trump is no longer a mystery, and the world is watching. So now, the question is yours to answer. Was this just an interview, or was it the beginning of something much bigger? Is Barron Trump stepping into the spotlight for good? Or was this a one-time statement before disappearing back into the shadows? We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think this means for his future? And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people see it. Subscribe for more, because this is just the beginning of a much bigger conversation. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And as always, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next one.